and welcome to a little chat here with David Blyth, the director of Death Warmed Up. And of course, we are very proud and delighted to be screening a 40th anniversary presentation of the film Death Warmed Up at Dark Nights Film Fest, coming up Friday, October 11th, 9:30 session. And so, look, thank you for devoting some time just to have a bit of a chat, David. I wanted to kick off, one of the really obvious things about Death Warmed Up is this wonderfully fierce, independent streak that runs through the film, a kind of fuck you attitude, the punk kind of attitude. And I wanted to ask you about the screenplay and how did that come about, and your collaboration with Michael Heath. Did you both have a very clear indication about the kind of story or script that you were going to write?
Well, we actually met at a Vincent Ward party, Michael Heath and I, and we both had an interest in cryogenics. And that was back in the day when Walt Disney was, leaving his head to be, resurrected in the future as part of cryogenics. So I was sort of fascinated by all of that. And Michael already had a little idea around cryogenics, but we sort of started working on a screenplay, because the interesting thing is that all of my filmmaking involves the family unit, if you like, and the destruction or the sort of penetration of it in a very kooky way. So working with Michael Heath was, an absolute joy. And he, of course, has some other Australian classics that he's written. So quite an interesting writer. And of course, we went on and did Moonrise as well together.
Yeah. Did you both have any particular influences, film-wise or movie-wise, that you both brought to the table initially when you started collaborating?
Well, I think there's three films. There's Blade Runner, there's the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I got to actually meet and hang out with Kim Henkel, who wrote the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And there's actually a spiritual message in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is that you've got to confront your own shadow, if you like. You've got to go back into the horror house and confront the chainsaw to actually get your own freedom and destiny.
Yeah.
So, and the third influence, obviously, was the Evil Dead film, and there are references to all three of those films in Death Warmed Up, and particularly the lighting and the use of smoke, because Blade Runner really was, I think, the most important film for me.
My favorite film.
Yeah, it still is for me. And I've been to places like Japan, and you arrive in Japan and in the rain and with all that neon. So it was, for me, I could see that Blade Runner was the future. And so it had just an absolute profound effect on me.
Yeah. Did you, when it came to then shooting, did you stick closely to the screenplay? Did you allow much room for improvisation?
A little bit of improvisation. The thing that really makes Death Warmed Up exciting is that the use of the Steadicam. And what that did is it unhooked the camera from a tripod and maybe, a 30-foot long track. And suddenly we were out there. And it's interesting, we had an anniversary screening where Michael Hurst came along, and he actually brought his son, who was like Jack, who was like 21 or something, or 20. that whole new generation of people were just blown away by Death Warmed Up, because yes, it's so unhooked from the normal traditional story tropes. And I think my whole journey as a filmmaker has been to try and push through the traditional narrative story tropes and find a new language, if you like.
Yeah, yeah.
And so yes, and the other unique thing about Death Warmed Up is that everyone from Michael Hurst through to the cameraman, through to the crew, we were all at the top of our game, but we were also all quite new, and it was just the most incredible combination of people.
Yeah.
And I look back at the film, it is just so far ahead of its time. Even Michael Glock's art direction and the slightly sci-fi medical stuff, and really it took New Zealand filmmaking, I think, also into a new direction.
Yeah, yeah. With the use of the Steadicam, of course, I mean, was James Bartle familiar with the Steadicam? Did he find it freeing up in terms of having to light the film, or did he actually find it quite difficult because you had so much more fluidity with the camera?
It actually presented obviously new challenges to him, and it meant we had to have quite a big lighting crew, particularly for some of those motorcycle sequences in the tunnels. And of course, those tunnels are real World War II tunnels. Some of them at the Auckland Naval Base, which is still under high security, and then a whole bunch of tunnels on Waiheke Island out at Stony Batter, and which has now been turned into some sort of entertainment centre. And we're hoping to have a screening of the film out there at some time in the summer.
Yeah.
But you know, being an Auckland-born person, I really wanted to utilise some of, you know, the natural environmental things that we have around Auckland, and we've got the volcanic stuff, we've got the tunnels and the old turrets and stuff from, you know, the preparation for various wars in the past.
Yeah.
Which of course never happened. We never did get any submarines, but of course Australia did. Sydney Harbour got some submarines World War II.
Did indeed. Yeah.
So but so Death Warmed Up it really came together very quickly. The Film Commission didn't get involved. There weren't 7 or 8 script drafts. It didn't go into that kind of development hell. It actually sort of went through quite fast, and the budget was only like 900,000 New Zealand dollars, which
I was going to ask about how the financing came together and whether that was a nightmare, pardon the pun, or whether you got what you were hoping for in terms of the budget. And you know, I guess you were probably aware it's like, well, a fair amount of this needs to go towards production design, special effects. You know, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, we had Kevin Chisnell, who was one of our great special effects guys, who worked on all the early stuff and ended up working up in Thailand towards the end of his career. Unfortunately, he's passed now, but you know, we had amazing explosions and all sorts of elements that really just, you know, were so exciting to work with. And
you probably did. I mean, were you shooting without permits a lot of the time?
No, we had, you know, around guns and explosives, there's a lot of regulations, a lot of practices that obviously didn't happen on a certain American production recently.
Yeah, for sure.
But certainly any gun on set the armorer has to show the actor open
Yeah.
the barrel and show the director
Yeah.
the empty barrel. That did not happen.
Yeah. On the American production. Yeah.
Yeah.
Rust, I think, or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
I just loved all that stuff, and you know, it was a time when the industry was still in its infancy, and so people would, you know, people were happy to put the time and the hours in. You know, health and safety, I think, hadn't been invented for
well,
film at that point, but
there you
now
go. Yeah. I'm
it's, you
sure
know,
some of the stuff you were shooting, yeah, you probably would find it more difficult to get, or there'd be more hoops to jump through and all that in order to.
oh, absolutely. And also the permitting around locations,
Well, that
everything
too.
has
Yeah.
become commercialized.
Yeah. Exactly. Was it a
And
long, was it a long production in terms?
it was a 5 week shoot.
Yeah. Yeah. But with a lot of pre-production.
Quite a bit of pre-production, yeah.
And then did you shoot in post? Had you covered it enough that you felt that you had a lot of room in the editing room, so to speak, to work with?
Well, yeah, I understood that you've got, you know, early on that you had to do coverage. And of course, again, with Steadicam, I can remember that, you know, the production manager being a bit, you know, worried that we were going through the film stock, the ratio of shooting, because of course, suddenly in the first days, we were already up to 10-to-1 ratio.
Wow.
Because, you know, that's the problem with Steadicam. If you do 6 or 7 3-minute takes, suddenly, you know, you're really piling through the
Stock.
footage. So
Yeah. Cool. What what were some of the highlights during the principal shoot, and what were some of the hard moments?
Oh, well, like, you know, I think doing all the, you know, the highlights were definitely doing all the motorcycle sequences and stuff in the tunnels. But there were obviously a lot of technical issues in terms of lighting those tunnels and getting the power in there. And it meant having, you know, the whole production with generators. And so, you know, it's a long time ago, but I just loved working with the actors. Of course, Bruno Lawrence is in there.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And that was the second time I'd worked with Bruno. By then he was quite famous.
Yeah. And
But
Margaret Umbers, I think Margaret Umbers should have been a real star. You know, she has a lot of wonderful screen charisma, I think.
absolutely, and she still is out there playing music. She's actually very
Okay.
musical.
That leads me into the next question, which of course, I mean, music, the score is a very key element of the film. And tell me a little bit about how that came about and the musicians. I mean, I think Annie Crummer did some vocals.
She did something on the end.
Yeah. But
there's Mark. Yeah, there's various musicians involved in there. Mark Nicholas is the composer,
yeah.
and he actually we did 3 films together, and so Angel Mine.
Yeah. Was that a no-brainer that you were going to use him again? And you know,
well, he just provided. He was so off the wall as a composer musician. So, and I think his Death Warmed Up composition was just, you know, so fantastic and innovative. And
totally. I mean, it sounds now so fresh, but especially, you know, in recent years, there's been this real, in terms of horror movies, this real resurgence in some of that 80s vibe, you know, synth wave and all that. And so it really gives Death Warmed Up, you know, 40 years on, a sudden freshness again in terms of its musical vibe.
Absolutely. And it was one of the first Kiwi films to get a Dolby.
Right. Yep. Nice. Nice. Um, Now, where did the film first screen? Tell me a little bit about the release and, of course, it famously got banned in Australia and then finally released a year later with cuts, Um, Tell me a little bit about the release and your reactions.
Well, the interesting thing is that, all my films have come up against a little bit of censorship in Australia.
Yeah, it's usually Queensland. Do you remember there were the stickers that we used to get in New Zealand which said banned in Queensland? You know.
Mm.
um,
But the thing about Death Warmed Up, there's a number of things that happened. It got an initial interest in America, and it got a pre-sale of like 100,000 up front with a release in America. So it was sort of quite exciting, and that's when I actually moved up to America after Death Warmed Up. But the real tragedy around Death Warmed Up, which a lot of people don't know, is that an intern at the film unit in Wellington went into a bunker and was told to clean it out, clean out some stuff, but in fact took the negative cans with the red labels on the lid and actually burnt, trashed the negative of Death Warmed Up. So suddenly what was meant to be this huge, and Death Warmed Up is without doubt my most successful, most internationally accepted movie. But what sort of happened after a few years of it being in release is that we could no longer supply the materials
yeah, yeah,
for interested people interested companies. So the film sort of disappeared. And coming back to your censorship question, what happened is that every country decided that they would make cuts to the film because every country's got different regulations
yeah,
around, knife action,
yep. How far
the
blood should spurt.
how far and the frenzied, the knife action at the end with
Yeah,
killing the doctor. These are all
yeah,
bridges too far with the censorship. And so what happened is that every country had censorship issues with the film. So after the negative was burnt, we obviously spent years and years trying to see if we could find an unedited original print. This did not happen because distributors would, even knowing their own censorship issues in their own country, make cuts to the film before censorship.
yeah,
So we literally ended up in a situation where there were 32 cuts made overall throughout the world
wow, yeah, yeah,
of
yeah,
varying lengths, and obviously there was overlaps on particular stuff around bottles and faces and knives and
yeah,
so it became this sort of terribly long journey, and it wasn't really until the Heritage Trust was created. And then, of course, I'm not at the top of the New Zealand film pile in terms of filmmakers. So it also then took a few years for them to get to my films.
yeah,
And they were ultimately digitalized. And that's when we were able to use the digital technology to recreate the film that you are going to be screening.
yeah. The
All right,
restoration.
there is a tiny bit that's never been
Yeah,
found, but yeah, you know, it's we're only talking, you know, less than a minute.
Yeah.
And so I'm just so happy that the film, you know, is back in a digital format. And of course, that has now been licensed in America and in Australia
Yeah.
through Severin and Umbrella.
No, that's great.
And interestingly enough, the Umbrella have just relicensed it.
Yeah, which is great. Yeah.
Yeah, which is
Yeah.
great. So that it, you know, it's going to go on. And I think the interesting thing about my filmmaking is because I did, as we mentioned earlier, because I push the story tropes into new places. And I think because my understanding of the world we live in is that we live in a horror film.
Indeed.
So for me, I'm fascinated by the horror film that we live in every day, if you like,
Yeah.
and I'm also fascinated in the family unit, which we all come from, and how that can get skewed and how things can go terribly wrong. And so there's all sorts of apedal explosions, if you like, and
Yeah.
it took me into my early 60s to actually understand how all my filmmaking also revolves around my own quite intense family dynamic with the World War One war hero colonel that is my grandfather.
Right. Yeah. Wow.
And
Yeah.
an interesting thing is that horror films actually came out of World War One because World War One was the beginning of what we would call unimaginable horror.
Mm, mm. Yeah.
Suddenly you had 500 men all with, you know,
Yeah.
their eyes bleeding and blood coming out of their mouths because they'd
Yeah.
had been in a mustard attack.
Yeah.
So my
Absolutely.
grandfather survived, you know, 3 gas attacks and was shot in the head.
Ah,
And he helped liberate a French town called Licanoir. It's in France, and they've now got, interestingly enough, a Weta inspired museum, which is digital light and sound. You know, they've got rid of the concept of museums being where you have uniforms and
yeah.
gun rifles. So, you know, the museum world's changing. And obviously the cinematic theatrical world's changing. And, you
Oh
know,
gosh. Yeah.
and that's why again it's delightful that you are screening Death Warmed Up, because again that unfettered sort of, you know, it never stops. I think someone described the film as not being released, it escaped.
Yeah. No, I totally. Yeah. I think I made
And I think
that.
Jodorowsky called it an apocalypse of horror, you know, of
He did.
horror.
Yeah.
So, you know, it never stops. And at the premiere screening in Paris at the Festival of Horror and Science Fiction at the Grand Rex, you know, literally thousands of people. And part of the great thing about Death Warmed Up is that there's literally some kind of body puncturing explosion, whatever, virtually every 10 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it
So
is.
it just keeps unwinding and more stuff keeps happening, and it becomes this sort of tidal wave that sweeps over your consciousness, and
Yeah.
it's a delightful kind of journey.
Well, look, thank you so much, David, for taking time to have a chat to us and telling us some fabulous stories about the making of Death Warmed Up, and your insight into the state of it all now. We're looking very much towards showing your film at at Dark Nights, I should say. So thank you once again.